It is July 6th, and on Today in Murder, we go over a case described as more horrible than the Jack the Ripper killings. I do have to give you a serious warning before we dive into today's episode. This is dark and horrible. Viewers' discretion is advised. These are the Cleveland Torso murders. The Cleveland Torso murderer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, was an unidentified serial killer who was active in the 1930s in Cleveland, Ohio. The killing's characteristics was the disturbing dismemberment of bodies. In this case, there's 13 known victims. The killer would dispose of the victims' remains in the poor neighborhood of Kingsbury Run. Most victims came from an area east of here called the Roaring Third or Hobo Jungle. This area was known for its bars, gambling dens, and brothels. Despite a lengthy investigation of the murders, the killer was never caught. In fact, it's heavily believed he moved on to some other states to commit the same gruesome crimes. Between 1921 and 1942, 9 people, 8 of them unidentified, were found dead and dismembered in swamps or around train yards near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. These were called the murder swap killings. It has been theorized to be additional victims of the Cleveland Torso murderer. There's an almost identical similarity between the Pittsburgh victims to those in Cleveland, both of which were directly connected by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The headless body of an unidentified male was found in a boxcar in Newcastle, Pennsylvania on July 1st, 1936. 3 headless victims were also found in boxcars near on May 3rd, 1940. All these bore a similar injury to those inflicted by the Torso murderer. Dismembered bodies were also found in the swamps near Newcastle between 1921 and 1934, as well as between 1939 and 1942, just before and after the Cleveland killing spree. There's even a possible Dahlia murder connection, but we won't dive into that one today. Out of the 13 known for sure Torso murders, only 2 were absolutely identified, with 1 being a probable identification. With that being said, today, on July 6th, we're about to go over John Doe number 5. On July 6, 1937, the upper portion of a man's torso, plus his 2 thighs, were found wrapped in a burlap sack used for chicken feed, floating in the river. This river is in Cleveland Flats just below Kingsbury Run. The head of this victim, as well as the internal organs within the abdomen and his heart, were never found. The unidentified male became known as John Doe number 5. This is out of 10 total Jane and John Does of this spree. Due to the severe decomposition of most of his victims, it's often believed that these unfortunate souls will never be identified by more than a number. With there being almost no information on the victims, that makes it very hard for there to be a suspect. The murders weren't targeted in a typical way you normally see in serial killings. For instance, Ted Bundy targeted young women. Zodiac targeted couples. The Cleveland Torso murderer targeted whoever crossed their path. With this, there's obviously almost no way to find the killer. Well, even with the lack of information and the lack of motive, detectives still managed to come up with a few main suspects. During the search for the killer, investigators interrogated around 9,100 people. At the end of it all, remained 2 main suspects thought to have likely been the Cleveland Torso murderer. On August 24, 1939, a 52-year-old Cleveland resident named Frank Dolezal was arrested. Frank, who at one point lived with a known identified victim, Florence Polio, was arrested for being suspected of Florence's murder. Interestingly, Frank also had connections to Edward Andrassi, the other identified victim. Case closed, right? Well, no. He later died under suspicious circumstances in the county jail while he was in custody. Dolezal was later exonerated of involvement in the torso slayings after his death. The next suspect was a man by the name of Dr. Frank Sweeney. Dr. Sweeney was a veteran of World War I who was part of the medical unit that conducted amputations in the field. At one point, Dr. Sweeney suffered nerve damage from a gas attack, and after the war, Sweeney became an alcoholic. His heavy drinking began in 1929, and by 1934, his alcoholism led to a separation from his wife. Sweeney was personally interviewed by the lead investigator, but before the interrogation, Sweeney was found to have been so drunk that he had to be held in a hotel room for 3 days until he sobered up. During questioning, he's said to have failed 2 very early versions of the polygraph test. That's what's commonly called a lie detector test. Both tests were administered by a polygraph expert who told the lead investigator that Sweeney was definitely the culprit. Even with this, the lead investigator felt there was little chance of obtaining a successful prosecution. Sweeney was the first cousin of one of Ness's, the lead investigator's, political opponents who had mocked Ness publicly for his failure to catch the killer. After all this, Sweeney committed himself to an institution. There were no more leads or connections that police could assign to him as a possible suspect. Sweeney died in a veterans hospital in Dayton, Ohio on July 9, 1964. While Sweeney was considered a viable suspect, the evidence against him was purely circumstantial. In 1929, Sweeney was a surgical resident in the Kingsbury Run area. In 1934, a man named Emil Fronick claimed a doctor had tried to drug him. Emil's story was ultimately discounted as he couldn't find the building with police the following day. Eventually, police found a victim with drugs in her system. Upon looking through buildings, it was found that Sweeney did have an office next to a coroner, in the same area where Emil had suggested that he had been drugged. Sweeney is said to have practiced in their morgue, which would have been a clean and convenient location to kill victims. But once again, this is all pure circumstantial. The disgusting case of the Cleveland torso murders may never be officially solved. With the future of DNA, maybe one day the 10 unidentified victims will be identified. But for now, the July 6th murder of John Doe No. 5 remains a mystery. Today is July 6th. I'm your host, Dawson Toller, and on Today in Murder, that was John Doe No. 5.